Here we go. This is part 2 commentary on the book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, written by Professor Joel Baden. And so in part 1, we talked about the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And we shed some light on the contradictions and some of the problems with the narrative and the flow of the story. And so we also talked about how this story has been tormenting many of the scholars and rabbis for many, many centuries, right? And how it has taken over 1,000 years to get some sort of satisfactory explanation as to why the story appears the way it does, right? And so what we're going to do is do a quick recap on the major problems in the story before we go into the solution and crack the code. And so we're going to start here in Genesis 37 verse 28, where it says, "When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt." And so the Midianite traders passed by and they pulled Joseph out of the pit. And understand that some people will try to say that it's the brothers pulling Joseph out of the pit. But the fact is that that doesn't change the major problem of the text, even if it were the brothers who pulled Joseph out of the pit, right? But the text is clear here as it is written that it's the Midianites that are pulling Joseph out of the pit. And so Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites, who brought him to Egypt. Right? So who brought Joseph into Egypt according to verse 28? It's the Ishmaelites, right? And we can all easily see this because it is as clear as day, right? The basics that we're talking about. But stay focused and watch what happens in verse 36, right? Of the same chapter. It says the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward. So now in verse 36, who is it that brought Joseph into Egypt? We can see that the text is clear that it is the Midianites who bring Joseph into Egypt, right? It changed it up. In verse 28, it was the Ishmaelites. And now in verse 36, it is claiming that it's the Midianites, and they both can't be right. This is what is called a blatant contradiction, right? Anyone looking at the text with clear vision could see that this is a huge problem in the story as it is written, right? And this is why the rabbis had to use the midrashic method of trying to fix this problem, right? Filling in the story with their own personal narratives that can't be found in the text, right? People come up with some elaborate things, but when you go and flip through the pages of the Bible, you'll find out that that's not there, right? But the fact that the people had to create these especially skillful interpretations, it goes to show that they understood quite well that they had a real problem on their hands. So again, we have verse 28 where it says the Ishmaelites bring Joseph to Egypt. And then in verse 36, it says the Midianites bring Joseph into Egypt. Then when you go 2 chapters over to Genesis 39 verse 1, it complicates the problem even further by saying this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. You see that? So the question is, who actually brought Joseph down to Egypt? Was it the Ishmaelites, like it says in Genesis 37 verse 28 and Genesis 39 verse 1? Or was it the Midianites, like it says in Genesis 37 verse 36? Right? The code can never be cracked when you read the text as it stands. And so over 1,000 years of staring at this problem, the consciousness of humans had finally developed to a point where it could unravel the puzzle with some satisfaction. Right? And so the secret to cracking this code lies in what is known as the documentary hypothesis, which states that there are 4 independent narratives from 4 independent sources, which were woven together to make a single unified document. And so the 4 sources are known as J, E, P, and D, right? And each of these sources tells their own version of traditional Israelite stories, right? They each have their own agenda and they each have their own particular message that they want to convey, which factor into the way that they tell their version of the story. So in the Joseph story, we're dealing with 2 sources, J and E. And so here's what it looks like without any indication that there are 2 stories woven together, right? This is how Genesis 37, 18 through 36 would read in just a traditional Bible. And now this is what it looks like when the scholars have distinguished the 2 sources, right? The J sources is in the normal font and the E source is in the bold font. Right? So take a look at this and go over it multiple times. And so now we have both sources completely separated. And once again, the E is in the bold and the J is in the normal font. So let's go over each of these stories on its own, and watch what happens after we do that, right? Let's start with the E version first in Genesis 37, verse 18.
They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. They took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to a meal. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
Now, what's the main theme in the E narrative, right? We have Joseph's brother in verse 18 conspiring to kill him. And then Reuben hears about it and persuades them not to kill him, but instead just to cast him into that pit, right? A specific pit in the wilderness. Pay attention. And Reuben wants them to put Joseph into that pit because he's got a plan to come back later to rescue Joseph. And so in the E source, the brothers actually throw him in the pit. And then afterwards, they go get a meal, right? The job is done, right? You can rub their hands together. We've taken care of Joseph. And now it's time to go eat something. And while they're eating, then the Midianite traders slide by, right? And they see Joseph and they grab him out of the pit. And so Reuben makes his way back to the pit. Why is Reuben going back to the pit? Remember in verse 22, his intention was to save Joseph and bring him back to his father Jacob, right? And so when Reuben goes back to the pit, he tears his clothes because at this point he's upset because his plan is ruined. And so he runs back to tell his brothers. And while he's doing that, the Midianites who kidnapped Joseph, they've brought him down into Egypt and have sold him to Potiphar. Right? Simple enough. Now let's go over the J narrative and find out what happens in that story and how that story plays out when it's viewed on its own.
They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say, 'A savage beast devoured him.' We shall see what comes of his dreams." When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him." Joseph was torn by a beast. Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him.
What's the theme in the J narrative? The brothers see Joseph in verse 20. They want to kill him and then throw him into one of the pits. Understand, right? The pit is to be used to get rid of the body. Whereas in the E narrative, the brothers only want to kill Joseph, but Reuben suggests an alternative to just throw him into that pit. So back to J. And so far we have the brothers wanting to kill Joseph and put the body into one of the pits. And then they will say that a savage beast killed him, right? And they're doing this because he had a dream in which they interpreted him as ruling over them in the future. And so when Joseph comes to his brothers, they snatch off his tunic or his undergarment, and then they look up and they saw the Ishmaelites coming from Gilead and going into Egypt. Pay attention. Then Judah is the one who steps in and interrupts the original plan of killing Joseph. Whereas in E, it was Reuben who played that role of stepping in and interfering. And so Judah says not to kill Joseph and thought it to be more appropriate to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites who were heading down to Egypt. And so the brothers agreed and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And what did they do with Joseph after the sale? They brought him down to Egypt. Here we go. Then the brothers killed a ram, and they took the tunic that they had stripped from Joseph, and they covered it in the ram's blood, right? They're trying to cover up what they just did. And so they bring it to Joseph's father, and then he's badly hurt by the news, and so he mourns. Right now, right before our eyes, we see two complete and coherent stories in which both of these narratives flow perfectly natural on their own. Right now, guess what else? We have finally cracked the code and solved that nagging problem of who actually sold Joseph into Egypt. Right? The E narrative believes that it's the Midianites, and the J narrative believes that it was the Ishmaelites. And so one of the important things to understand is that when the stories are separated, then something magical happens. The contradictions disappear. Right? It's not saying one thing in one verse and then completely changing it to something else in another. Right? The storyline stays consistent throughout. So when we get to Genesis 39, where it says that the Ishmaelites sold Joseph, scholars attribute this to being a continuation of the J narrative because they both have Joseph being sold by the Ishmaelites. Right? And when we run into Genesis 45, verse 4, where it says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt, scholars also attribute that to J because in Genesis 37, verse 28, it was the brothers that sold him. Right? And this is consistent with the J narrative. But when we run into a verse like Genesis 40, verse 15, where Joseph says, indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, then the scholars attribute that to the E source because in Genesis 37, verse 28, the other half, the Midianites are the ones that steal Joseph and they bring him to Egypt, and the brothers had nothing to do with that particular activity. Right? So it starts to all flow. And also what I want people to understand is that nothing had to be added to the story or taken away from it. Right? The scholars just had to figure out where the sources were woven together and then separate them out. Right? But this was not, and it's still not an easy task. And scholars are still working on this issue. But up until today, this is the best explanation for why the biblical text looks the way it does and why it has the problems that it has. And so it has been the best demonstrable explanation in recent history. But if one comes along that's more convincing, right, then we'll go with that. No problem. Right? But that's how accurate knowledge works. And so a very valuable resource to help people get a visual on the four sources completely separated in the Bible. I recommend a book called The Bible with Sources Revealed by leading biblical scholar Dr. Richard Elliott Freeman. And in this book, he has a section which provides the first 5 books of the Bible with the verses color-coded to match the sources that they belong to, right? The J, E, P, and D. Right? And that book is highly recommended and extremely helpful, right? As a source for someone who wants to see information laid out in this type of format, right? And so I've got the Kindle version, but the book only works on the computer, right? It doesn't work on an iPhone or an iPad or any of those type of devices, right? So if you're thinking about getting a Kindle version, then understand that, right? If that's a problem, then just go ahead and get the physical copy and that'll do the job too. Right. And so this is the end of part 2 commentary on the composition of the Pentateuch by Dr. Joel Baden. And I want to thank you for watching until the end. Make sure to stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be going into some more information on the sources. Right. So my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 3.